My name is Julia Morrison, and I'm 28 years old. The garage still smelled like motor oil and my father's old paint cans when my mother set up a folding chair back there for me on Thanksgiving morning. She didn't even try to soften it. She simply carried my plate, my fork, my little cloth napkin through the kitchen door, set them down on a card table beside Dad's toolbox, and said the words I'll never forget as long as I live: "Your sister's new boyfriend needs your seat." That was it. No apology, no explanation beyond that single sentence, as though I were a folding chair myself, something to be shuffled around whenever someone more important needed the space. I stood frozen in the doorway for a moment, waiting for someone to laugh, to admit it was a joke, to tell me to come sit at the real table with the real tablecloth and the real candles. No one did. My sister Renata didn't even glance up from her phone. My mother drifted back inside as casually as if she only rearranged a centerpiece. So I sat in the garage. I ate my turkey off a paper plate balanced on my knees, next to a pegboard of wrenches and a rake propped against the wall, listening to the muffled laughter and clinking glasses drifting through the door. I told myself this wasn't the first time this family had made me feel like an afterthought, and it probably wouldn't be the last. Ever since my grandfather had passed away 8 months earlier, something had shifted in the way my mother looked at me, as though she were constantly weighing whether I deserved a place in her house at all. I chewed slowly, staring at the cracked concrete floor, and made myself a quiet promise that this would be the last Thanksgiving I'd let anyone treat me this way. I had no idea yet how soon that promise would be tested, or how strange the timing of it all would turn out to be. When I finally went back inside for a second helping of stuffing, the dining room fell into a silence that didn't make sense to me at first. I walked past the table toward the kitchen without looking at anyone, still nursing that stubborn hurt from the garage. Then I felt it. The boyfriend looked up at me, and his fork clattered onto his plate. It wasn't a small sound, loud enough that my aunt startled in her seat and the gravy boat wobbled. I turned to see what had happened, and that's when I saw his face. He'd gone completely pale, as if every drop of blood had drained out of him at once. His eyes were locked on mine, wide and almost frightened, like he'd seen something he desperately didn't want to see. I didn't recognize him fully in that split second, but something in my stomach twisted anyway, some old, familiar unease creeping up before my mind even caught up with my gut. My mother, oblivious as ever to anything that didn't directly serve her own comfort, leaned toward him with a curious little smile. "Do you two know each other?" she began to ask, and I watched his hand move before she'd even finished the sentence. He wasn't reaching for his napkin. He was reaching for his coat, which had been draped over the back of his chair the entire meal, as if some part of him had been bracing for an exit long before this moment arrived. His chair screeched against the hardwood as he pushed back from the table, mumbling something about needing air, about his phone buzzing, about a work emergency that clearly didn't exist. Renata grabbed his arm, bewildered, asking what was wrong, but he wouldn't even look at her. He wouldn't look at anyone except me, for one long, terrible second, and in that second, I finally placed his face. It hit me like ice water down my spine. I knew exactly who he was, and exactly why he looked like he'd seen a ghost. The room kept talking around me, kept asking questions, kept spinning in confusion, but all I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears as 3 years of buried memories came rushing back at once. My mother's voice sounded distant now, still finishing her question, still waiting for an answer no one in that room was ready to give her. I stood frozen in the doorway between the kitchen and the dining room, one hand still holding my empty plate, watching a grown man practically sprint for the front door of my parents' house on Thanksgiving Day, leaving my sister humiliated and confused in front of the entire family. No one understood what had just happened, no one except me, and possibly him. What none of us realized yet, not even me, was that this collision at the dinner table was about to unravel something far bigger than an awkward reunion, something tied directly to my grandfather's fortune, and a secret my own mother had been sitting on for 8 months without saying a word to me. I set my plate down on the counter, hands trembling slightly, and followed the sound of the front door slamming. Through the window, I watched him practically jog to his car, fumbling with his keys twice before finally wrenching the door open. Renata came storming past me, demanding to know what I'd done to scare him off, her voice cracking somewhere between fury and embarrassment. I didn't answer right away. I was too busy assembling the pieces in my head, pieces that had lain scattered and half forgotten for 3 years. His name wasn't the one Renata had used to introduce him at the start of dinner. When I'd known him, briefly and painfully, he'd gone by an entirely different name, and he'd worked his way into my life with the same careful, practiced charm he must have used on her. Back then, he'd talked me into handing over almost $11,000 for what he called a guaranteed investment opportunity, money I never saw again, along with the man himself, who vanished within weeks of cashing my check. I told Renata everything right there in the driveway, while our mother stood on the porch with her arms crossed, looking more annoyed than concerned. I explained how he operated, how he sought out women who seemed a little lonely, a little eager to be loved, and how he took what he needed before slipping into whatever version of himself he'd wear next. Renata's face crumpled as the truth sank in, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, my sister actually apologized to me for not believing me sooner, for never even asking why I'd gone so quiet 3 Thanksgivings ago, back when I'd stopped mentioning the boyfriend I once talked about so often. My mother, though, seemed far more focused on damage control than comfort, muttering something about how none of us could have known, before quickly changing the subject to clearing the dessert table. I understood then that some things in this family weren't going to change just because a con man got caught in the act. But something else was about to change everything else entirely, and it started with a phone call I never saw coming. 3 days later, I got a call from a lawyer named Whitfield Grant, who introduced himself as the executor of my grandfather's estate. I assumed it was routine, something about funeral costs, or a small keepsake being divided among the grandchildren, maybe his old fishing rods or the watch he always wore. Instead, he asked if I could come to his office that afternoon, alone, without my mother or sister present. Something in his tone made my stomach tighten for the entire drive over. I sat across from his desk an hour later, still confused, as he slid a thick folder toward me and explained that my grandfather had quietly revised his will 4 months before he died, working directly with Whitfield's office and telling almost no one in the family. Watching my face carefully, as though bracing for tears or an argument, he told me that my grandfather had named me, and only me, sole heir to his entire estate, the house upstate, his investment accounts, and a manufacturing business worth far more than anyone in my family had ever let on. My mother, it turned out, had known for months and had said absolutely nothing, choosing instead to treat me like an inconvenience while quietly hoping the will might somehow be contested or changed before the truth came out. Whitfield explained that she'd actually come to his office twice in recent months, asking pointed questions about whether the will could still be altered, whether there was any legal way to divide things differently among her daughters. Both times, he'd told her plainly that my grandfather's wishes had been clearly documented, properly witnessed, and were not going to change. Hearing that, sitting in that quiet office with the folder open in front of me, I finally understood why my mother had been looking at me differently these past 8 months, why every interaction had felt like quiet resentment for something I hadn't even known was happening. Something cracked open in my chest, some strange mixture of grief and vindication I didn't yet have words for. My grandfather used to tell me, when I was young, that loyalty was worth more than blood. Now I understood exactly what he'd meant. He'd watched quietly for years, noticing who actually showed up for him at the hospital, who called just to talk, and who only appeared for what he could give them. He'd seen enough, and he'd made his decision long before he ever got sick. I drove home that evening with the folder sitting on the passenger seat, thinking about that folding chair in the garage, about the toolbox, about the fork clattering onto a plate just days before, and I realized the universe has a strange sense of timing, delivering justice and truth on the very same holiday, at the very same table, within the very same hour. My mother had spent 8 months trying to keep me small, trying to keep me in that garage, both literally and figuratively, never imagining that the very thing she was hiding would end up defining the rest of both our lives. The manufacturing business alone would need new leadership soon, and Whitfield had already hinted that my grandfather had left detailed notes about exactly how he hoped I'd run it.